At the exact moment my son leaned back in his chair, a slow, satisfied smirk spreading across his face, and told me I had exactly 60 minutes to clear out of what he now called his house, I noticed something oddly specific: the way he tapped his fingers twice against the edge of the mahogany table. That same table his father and I had picked out 32 years ago from a small furniture store in Ohio, back when we still argued over finishes and laughed about who had better taste. I remember thinking, not about the insult itself, but about that rhythm. 2 taps. Like a signal. Like something rehearsed. The room was full, yet it had never felt more hollow. My daughter-in-law sat beside him, legs crossed neatly, her wine glass untouched, her eyes fixed on me with that polite, distant expression she had perfected over the years, the kind that looked like respect from afar, but up close felt like dismissal. No one spoke. Not even my grandson, who had been scrolling on his phone just moments earlier. Silence settled over the table like dust, thick and suffocating. And in that silence, my son repeated himself, slower this time, as if speaking to someone who had already begun to fade. 60 minutes, Mom. That's more than fair. I smiled. Not because I found anything amusing, but because after 71 years of life, you learn that some moments demand stillness, not reaction. Especially when everyone in the room is watching, waiting, hoping for you to break. I reached for my napkin, folded it carefully, and placed it beside my plate as if we had just finished an ordinary family dinner. The roast I had spent all afternoon preparing sat untouched in front of me, the scent of rosemary and garlic now faint, almost irrelevant. Just hours earlier, I had stood in that same kitchen, adjusting the oven temperature, setting the table with the good china, the one reserved for holidays and meaningful occasions. I had thought, perhaps foolishly, that tonight might be one of those nights where things felt normal again. Where grief would sit quietly in the corner instead of at the head of the table. Where my son might look at me the way he used to, before life and marriage had taught him to look elsewhere. But instead, here we were. "Did you hear me?" he asked, his voice tightening just enough to reveal the impatience beneath it. "Oh, I heard you," I replied softly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. I glanced around the table, meeting each pair of eyes briefly. Some looked away quickly. Others didn't look at all. That was the thing about betrayal, it rarely arrived with noise. It slipped in quietly, settled into routines, disguised itself as practicality, as logic, as necessity. Until one day, it sat across from you at dinner and told you that you no longer belonged in your own life. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. My knees didn't tremble. My hands didn't shake. If anything, I felt clear. Clearer than I had in weeks. "That should be enough time," my daughter-in-law added, her tone light, almost helpful, as if she were offering directions rather than an eviction. "We already called a moving company. They can be here first thing in the morning." Of course they had. I nodded once, acknowledging the efficiency of it all. The planning. The quiet coordination that must have taken place behind closed doors, in conversations I was no longer part of. For a brief second, I allowed myself to look at my son, not the man sitting in front of me, but the boy he used to be. The one who clung to my hand on his first day of school. The one who cried when his goldfish died and insisted we hold a funeral in the backyard. That boy would have never imagined this moment. Then again, neither had I. "I'll take care of it," I said simply. No argument. No raised voice. Just a statement. He seemed almost disappointed by that. As if he had prepared himself for resistance, for tears, for something he could point to later and say, "See? That's why we had to do it." But I gave him nothing. And sometimes, nothing is the most unsettling response of all. I turned and walked toward the hallway, my steps measured, my back straight. Each movement deliberate. I could feel their eyes following me, trying to read something, anything, into my silence. But there was nothing left for them to read. Not anymore. Because what they didn't know, what my son in his certainty and my daughter-in-law in her quiet calculation couldn't possibly have known, was that by the time he had finished that sentence, by the time his fingers tapped twice against that table, I had already rewritten the rules of the game. The hallway felt longer than it had an hour ago. Funny how a place you've walked through thousands of times can suddenly feel unfamiliar, like it belongs to someone else. My hand brushed lightly against the wall as I passed the framed photographs, birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings, frozen moments where I still had a place, where I still mattered. I didn't stop to look at them. Not yet. I had learned, over the past few weeks, that looking back too soon could weaken your resolve. And tonight, of all nights, I couldn't afford that. I reached my bedroom door and paused for just a second before pushing it open. The room greeted me the same way it always had, quiet, orderly, untouched by the tension that now filled the rest of the house. The bed was neatly made. My cardigan still draped over the chair where I'd left it that morning. On the nightstand, my husband's watch rested exactly where I had placed it after the funeral, its face still, its hands frozen at the time his heart had given out. Time had stopped for him. For me, it had simply shifted. I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me, not to shut them out, but to give myself space to think. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second now carrying a different kind of weight. 60 minutes. That's what he had given me. An hour to dismantle a life. An hour to pack away decades of memories, sacrifices, quiet victories no one ever noticed. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and let the silence settle around me. Not heavy. Not suffocating. Just still. The kind of stillness that comes right before something changes. If someone had walked in at that moment, they might have thought I was in shock. That I hadn't fully processed what had just happened. But the truth was, I had been processing it for a long time. Long before tonight. Long before the words were spoken out loud. It had started in small ways, the kind you almost convince yourself you're imagining. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Documents left face down on the table that used to sit openly. My son asking questions about logistics and ownership, in a tone that felt more like business than family. And her, always nearby, always listening, always guiding the conversation just enough to make it seem like his idea. I leaned back slightly, my eyes drifting toward the window. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the yard. That yard. I remembered planting the oak tree out there with my husband the year our son turned 10. He had dug the hole too deep, insisted it needed room to grow strong. We laughed about it for years. Now the tree stood tall, steady, rooted in soil we had chosen together. Some things, once planted properly, couldn't be uprooted so easily. I stood up and walked to the closet, opening it with the same calm precision I had used at the dinner table. Inside, everything was exactly where it should be. Dresses arranged by season. Shoes lined neatly along the bottom. Boxes stacked on the top shelf, each one holding pieces of a life that had been built, not borrowed. I reached for one of those boxes, pulling it down carefully and placing it on the bed. Inside were old documents, insurance papers, property records, things most people would have overlooked or handed off years ago. But I had always been the one who kept things organized. My husband used to say I had a mind for details, that I saw things others didn't. At the time, it felt like a compliment. Now, it felt like preparation. I opened the folder tucked inside and flipped through the pages slowly, not searching, just confirming. Dates. Signatures. Clauses written in language most people skim past without understanding. I had read every word of it weeks ago, the first time something didn't feel right. The first time I realized that what was happening around me wasn't confusion or miscommunication, it was strategy. And strategy, when left unchecked, becomes assumption. They had assumed I wouldn't notice. Assumed I wouldn't understand. Assumed that grief had made me weak. I closed the folder and placed it back in the box, my movements unhurried. There was no need to rush. Not anymore. Because the truth was, this wasn't the beginning of the end for me. It was the end of something else entirely, something they hadn't even realized they were part of. I walked over to the dresser and picked up my phone, scrolling briefly before stopping on a name I hadn't needed to call in years. My thumb hovered for a second, then pressed. It rang once. Twice. Hello? Hi, Martin. It's me. My voice was calm, steady, exactly the way I needed it to be. I think it's time we move forward. There was a pause on the other end. Not confusion. Recognition. I was wondering when you'd call, he said quietly. I allowed myself the smallest of smiles, not the kind anyone downstairs would ever see. The kind that doesn't ask for attention. The kind that comes from knowing something others don't. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Downstairs, they were probably still sitting at that table, thinking the hardest part was over. Thinking they had already won. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that by the time my son had given me those 60 minutes, I had already decided exactly how they were going to lose. I stayed on the phone with Martin just long enough to confirm what I already knew, and just short enough not to give anything away. When I ended the call, the room felt even quieter, but not empty. Focused. Like everything had finally aligned into place. I set the phone down gently and glanced once more at the clock. 42 minutes left. Funny how time stretches when people think they're rushing you, and shrinks when you're already ahead of them. I didn't start packing. Not really. I pulled a small suitcase from the closet, placed it on the bed, and laid a few essentials inside with calm, deliberate movements. One change of clothes, my medication, a framed photo of my husband that I didn't need but chose to bring anyway. Not because I was leaving for good, but because sometimes you take things with you not out of necessity, but out of respect for what they meant. Downstairs, I could hear faint movement now, chairs shifting, low voices, the occasional clink of glass. They were talking. Of course they were. Trying to make sense of my silence. Trying to reassure each other that what they had done was reasonable, justified, necessary. That's the thing about people who cross a line, they don't usually see it as crossing. They see it as stepping forward. Progress. Improvement. I walked over to the dresser and opened the top drawer, running my fingers lightly over the neatly folded scarves inside. My daughter-in-law had once complimented one of them, said it looked expensive. I remember smiling at the time, thinking she meant it kindly. Now I understood, it had never been about the scarf. It had always been about value. What I had. What they could take. What they believed would eventually become theirs. I closed the drawer and turned toward the door, opening it just enough to step back into the hallway. The air felt different now. Thinner. Charged. As I walked past the staircase, their voices became clearer. My son's tone carried that same edge it had at the table, confident, controlled, just a little too rehearsed. She'll be out soon, he said. She doesn't have a choice. There was a pause, then my daughter-in-law's voice, softer but sharper in its own way. Just make sure she doesn't try anything complicated. We need this clean. Clean. That word lingered in my mind for a moment. Clean meant simple. Predictable. Easy to manage. They still thought this was simple. I continued down the hallway, my steps quiet against the hardwood floor, and stopped just before the living room entrance. From where I stood, I could see them without being seen. My son was leaning against the back of a chair, arms crossed, his posture relaxed in the way people only are when they believe they've already secured the outcome. She sat at the table, finally sipping her wine, her gaze fixed on something in front of her, papers. Of course. Even now, she was organizing, aligning, making sure everything fit neatly into the version of reality she had constructed. For a moment, I simply watched them. Not with anger. Not even with disappointment. Just clarity. It's a strange feeling, seeing people exactly as they are, without the layers of memory or hope softening the edges. My son wasn't confused. He wasn't being manipulated as much as I once believed. He had chosen this. Maybe not all at once. Maybe not without influence. But choice, even when gradual, is still choice. I stepped back before they could notice me and returned to my room, closing the door with the same quiet precision as before. 30 minutes now. I sat down at the small desk by the window and opened the folder again, this time pulling out a single document and placing it flat in front of me. The paper was smooth, the ink clean and unmistakable. My husband's signature sat at the bottom, firm and deliberate, just as it always had been. He had never rushed decisions. Never assumed things would simply fall into place. He believed in preparation. In protecting what mattered before it needed protecting. I traced the edge of the page lightly with my fingertip, remembering the day we had sat in Martin's office, going over every detail. Just in case, my husband had said, his tone casual, but his eyes serious. I had laughed back then, told him he was overthinking things. That our son would never need something like this. That family didn't work that way. He hadn't argued. He had just smiled, signed the document, and handed it back. Now, sitting here with the sun dipping lower and the clock ticking steadily toward the hour my son had given me, I finally understood what he had seen that I hadn't. Not betrayal. Not specifically. But possibility. The possibility that one day, someone might forget where everything came from. Who built it? Who held it together when things were fragile and uncertain? I folded the document carefully and slipped it back into the folder, then closed the box and returned it to the shelf. There was no need to carry it downstairs. Not yet. Timing matters. Delivery matters. And right now, what mattered most was letting them believe their version of the story had already taken hold. That I was upstairs, quietly packing, quietly accepting, quietly stepping out of the life they had decided no longer belonged to me. I stood and walked back to the window, watching as the last stretch of sunlight slipped behind the trees. The sky deepened, colors fading into something cooler, calmer. Evening was settling in. And with it, the kind of stillness that doesn't signal an ending, but a shift. They had given me 60 minutes. What they didn't realize was that I had only needed one. I didn't go back downstairs right away. Not because I was hesitating, but because there are moments in life when rushing only serves the other side. And I had no intention of playing by their pace anymore. Instead, I sat there by the window as the last light drained from the sky, letting the quiet settle fully into the room. It wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from loneliness. It was the kind that comes when everything finally makes sense. When the pieces stop shifting and lock into place. For years, long before tonight, I had been living inside a version of my family that no longer existed. I just hadn't realized it yet. Or maybe I had, in small ways, and chose not to look too closely. It's easy to ignore change when it happens gradually. A missed phone call here. A shorter visit there. Conversations that once felt warm becoming efficient. Practical. My son had started using phrases like, "It just makes more sense," and "We have to think long term." At the time, I told myself that was maturity. That he was growing into a responsible man. But responsibility doesn't erase respect. And somewhere along the way, respect had quietly disappeared. I thought back to the first time I noticed something was off. It wasn't anything dramatic. Just a small moment, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. We had been sitting in this very house, just a few months after my husband passed. The grief was still fresh, still raw in ways I didn't fully show. I had made coffee, too strong, the way my husband used to like it, and set out 3 cups. My son had come over with his wife, and for a brief second, I believed that maybe, just maybe, we would find a way to hold on to something familiar. But instead of sitting at the table like we always had, they stood in the kitchen, talking quietly between themselves. Not arguing. Not even tense. Just, separate. Like I wasn't part of the conversation. Anymore. When I walked in, they stopped mid-sentence. Smiled. Changed the subject. I remember standing there, holding that 3rd cup, realizing I didn't know what they had been talking about. And more importantly, that I wasn't meant to. At the time, I let it go. Grief makes you generous in ways you don't even notice. You assume people are just being careful around you, giving you space. But space, when stretched too far, becomes distance. And distance, if left long enough, becomes replacement. I stood up slowly and walked over to the dresser, my fingers brushing against the smooth surface as I passed. There was a time when every decision in this house had run through me and my husband. Repairs, finances, even something as simple as rearranging the furniture, we talked about everything. Not because we needed permission from each other, but because that's what partnership looks like. You build something together, piece by piece, until it becomes more than just a structure. It becomes a life. And that life had been handed over. Not in one moment. Not with one signature. But gradually. Quietly. Through assumptions. Through silence. Through the belief that I would always step back when asked. I thought about the questions my son had started asking recently. Casual, almost careless on the surface. Do you still keep all the paperwork here? Would it be easier if we helped manage some of the bills? Have you thought about downsizing? Each one had seemed reasonable at the time. Practical. Even helpful. But now, looking back, they formed a pattern. A slow, careful shift of control. One that didn't feel like theft because it was wrapped in concern. And I had let it happen. Not because I was weak. But because I trusted him. Because I believed that no matter how much life changed, the foundation would remain the same. That the boy I raised, the one who once needed me for everything, would never see me as something to be managed. But tonight proved otherwise. I walked back toward the bed and rested my hand briefly on the suitcase I had packed. It looked small. Insignificant, almost. As if 60 minutes of someone else's decision could really fit into something that size. But that was the illusion, wasn't it? They believed this was about space. About logistics. About making things work better. It wasn't. It was about ownership. Control. Erasure. And the most dangerous part? They believed they had already succeeded. I let out a slow breath and glanced once more at the clock. 15 minutes left. Downstairs, I could hear movement again, footsteps this time, closer, more deliberate. They were preparing. Waiting for me to come down with my bags, with my resignation, with the quiet acceptance they had already written into their version of the story. I straightened slightly, smoothing my hands over the front of my blouse, not out of nervousness, but habit. Composure had always been something I carried, even in moments when everything else felt uncertain. And right now, it was the one thing I knew they weren't expecting. Because what they saw when they looked at me was a 71-year-old woman who had just lost her husband. Someone grieving. Someone fragile. Someone easy to move aside. What they didn't see, what they had never taken the time to see, was everything that came before that. The years of managing, organizing, building, protecting. The quiet decisions that kept this house standing, this family functioning. The strength that doesn't announce itself, but simply exists. I picked up my suitcase, not because I needed it, but because it was part of the moment they were expecting. And sometimes, the best way to change the outcome is to let people believe everything is going exactly as they planned. As I reached for the door, my reflection caught briefly in the mirror across the room. For a second, I stopped, not to question, not to doubt, but to recognize. The woman looking back at me wasn't broken. She wasn't even surprised anymore. She was ready. And downstairs, they were about to find out just how wrong they had been. I didn't rush down the stairs. I let each step land softly, evenly, the way you do when you know people are listening for something, panic, hesitation, weakness. But I gave them none of that. Just the quiet rhythm of someone who wasn't being pushed out, but was arriving exactly where she intended to be. The living room came into view slowly, the warm overhead light casting long shadows across the floor, the same floor I had polished for decades, the same space that had once held birthday parties, late-night talks, and the kind of laughter that doesn't need effort. Now it held something else entirely. Expectation. My son looked up first. Of course he did. He had been waiting. His posture straightened slightly when he saw the suitcase in my hand, and for just a brief moment, something like relief crossed his face. Not joy. Not pride. Just confirmation. As if everything was unfolding exactly as planned. My daughter-in-law followed his gaze, her expression calm, composed, already halfway to satisfied. She set her glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table as if even that small detail mattered. "You're done?" he asked, his tone casual, almost bored. Like this was a task we had both agreed to complete. I nodded once. "I'm done." That seemed to settle something in him. He exhaled quietly, stepping forward just enough to close the distance between us, but not enough to make it personal. "Good," he said. "This doesn't have to be difficult." No. It didn't. I placed the suitcase down beside the chair, not handing it off, not dragging it toward the door. Just placing it there, like an object that belonged in the room. Then I looked at him, not quickly, not emotionally, just directly. Long enough for him to feel it. Long enough for him to realize something wasn't quite aligning with the version of events he had already accepted. "I agree," I said calmly. "It doesn't have to be difficult." There was a pause. A small one. But enough. My daughter-in-law shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers brushing against the papers in front of her. "We've already arranged everything," she added, her voice smooth, measured. "The transfer, the timeline, it's all very straightforward." Straightforward. I let that word sit in the air for a second before I responded. "I'm sure it is," I said. "You've both been very thorough." My son frowned just slightly, not in confusion, but in irritation. He didn't like the tone. Not because it was confrontational, but because it wasn't. It didn't give him anything to push against. And people like him, in moments like this, need resistance. They need something to justify the force they've already decided to use. "Well," he said, crossing his arms again, "we just want to make sure everything is handled properly. There's no reason to drag this out." I almost smiled at that. Almost. "Properly," I repeated softly. Then I reached into my coat pocket, not quickly, not dramatically, and pulled out a single folded document. I didn't open it right away. I just held it between my fingers, letting the silence stretch just a little longer. That's when I saw it. The shift. It was subtle. But it was there. My daughter-in-law's eyes moved, not to me, but to the paper. Just for a second. But long enough to tell me she recognized it. Or at least, she recognized the possibility of it. Her posture changed, barely, but enough. The kind of adjustment you make when something you thought was settled suddenly, isn't. My son noticed it too. Not the paper itself, but her reaction. And that's when the certainty in his expression flickered. Just slightly. "What's that?" he asked, his voice a little sharper now. I unfolded the document slowly, smoothing it out with the same care I had used upstairs. No rush. No urgency. Because this wasn't about proving anything quickly. It was about letting the truth arrive exactly when it needed to. "Just something your father and I took care of," I said. The room went quiet again. But this time, it wasn't the kind of silence they controlled. This one belonged to me. I stepped forward and placed the document on the table, turning it just enough so they could see. I didn't explain it. I didn't point to any specific line. I didn't need to. Because people who build plans in secret tend to recognize the moment those plans start to fall apart. My son leaned in first, his eyes scanning the page quickly, then again more slowly. His jaw tightened. The confidence didn't disappear all at once, it cracked. Fractured in small, precise ways. "What is this?" he asked again, but this time, the question wasn't controlled. "It's the part you didn't account for," I replied quietly. My daughter-in-law reached for the paper, her composure slipping just enough to reveal something underneath. Not panic. Not yet. But calculation. Fast. Sharp. Trying to adjust, to reframe, to find a way back into control. But there wasn't one. Because what they had built relied on one simple assumption, that I didn't know. That I wouldn't understand. That I would accept whatever version of reality they placed in front of me. And that assumption was the only thing holding their plan together. I straightened slightly, my hands resting calmly at my sides, my voice steady as ever. You gave me 60 minutes, I said. But you forgot something important. They both looked up at me now. Fully. No more distractions. No more quiet confidence. Just attention. I only needed one. My son's fingers tightened around the edge of the document, the paper bending slightly under the pressure as his eyes moved faster now, line to line, searching, recalculating. The confidence he had worn just moments ago didn't disappear all at once. It resisted. Tried to hold its shape. But you could see it slipping, piece by piece, as reality began to settle in. My daughter-in-law leaned closer, her shoulder nearly brushing his, her gaze sharp and focused as she scanned the same lines. She didn't speak right away. That was her instinct, observe first, adjust second. But even she couldn't hide the slight tension in her jaw, the way her fingers paused just a fraction too long on the edge of the table. This doesn't change anything, my son said finally, though his voice lacked the certainty it had before. It sounded thinner now. Less like a statement, more like a hope he was trying to convince himself of. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch just long enough for that doubt to grow. Because doubt, once it starts, doesn't need much encouragement. It builds on its own. Are you sure? I asked calmly. That was enough. He looked back down at the document, slower this time. More carefully. And that's when it hit him, not all at once, but in stages. The wording. The structure. The clause buried just deep enough to be missed by someone who thought they already understood the outcome. His expression shifted, the tight control giving way to something more fragile. Confusion first. Then realization. This doesn't make sense, he said, but now he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at her. And she didn't answer right away. That told me everything I needed to know. Because if there had been a simple explanation, she would have given it. Instantly. Smoothly. She always did. But now, she hesitated. And in that hesitation, the entire foundation of their plan began to crack. It's outdated, she said finally, her voice measured, careful. There must be a newer version. Something more recent. I tilted my head slightly, not in challenge, but in quiet acknowledgement of the attempt. No, I said. There isn't. Another silence. Heavier this time. My son ran a hand through his hair, a habit he had picked up as a teenager whenever something didn't go the way he expected. Back then, it was about exams, or friendships, or small disappointments that felt big in the moment. Now, it was something else entirely. You're saying, he started, then stopped, as if the words themselves were difficult to form. I'm saying, I interrupted gently, that your father made sure everything was very clear. His eyes snapped back to mine then, searching, almost accusing. Why wouldn't you tell me this? That question hung in the air for a moment, heavier than anything else that had been said so far. Not because it was aggressive, but because, for the first time, it came from a place of uncertainty rather than control. I held his gaze, steady. Because you never asked. It landed exactly the way it needed to. Not as an attack. Not as a defense. Just as truth. My daughter-in-law shifted in her seat again, this time more noticeably. We're not trying to do anything wrong here, she said, her tone tightening just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. We were just trying to make things practical. Efficient. This house is too much for one person. You said that yourself. I nodded slightly. I did. And we've been helping, she continued quickly, leaning into the argument now, trying to regain footing. Handling things, organizing, making sure everything is in order, for you, I said quietly. She stopped. Just like that. Because sometimes, the simplest interruption is the most effective. For you, I repeated, not raising my voice, not changing my tone. Just clarifying. Not for me. My son exhaled sharply, stepping back as if needing space, his eyes moving between the document and the room, as if the walls themselves might offer some kind of explanation. This doesn't mean you can just stay here and, I'm not just staying, I said, cutting in gently again. I've always been here. Another pause. And this one was different. Because now, the conversation wasn't about time limits or moving trucks or who would take which room. It had shifted. Completely. From logistics, to legitimacy. My daughter-in-law leaned back slightly, her fingers tapping once against the table, just once this time. Not the confident rhythm from earlier. A different kind of movement. Calculating. Adjusting. Trying to find a new angle. We can talk about this, she said finally. There's no need to escalate things. Escalate. I almost smiled at that. I'm not escalating anything, I replied. I'm simply not stepping aside anymore. The room fell quiet again, but this time, it wasn't uncertain. It was settled. Defined. My son looked at me differently now. Not with dismissal. Not with impatience. But with something he hadn't shown all evening. Something he probably hadn't expected to feel at all. Doubt. And just beneath it, the beginning of understanding. Because the truth wasn't just in the document sitting between us. It was in the realization that the woman he thought he could move out of his way was never standing in his way to begin with. My son didn't speak right away after that. He just stood there, staring at the document like it might rearrange itself if he looked long enough. Like the answer he wanted might suddenly appear between the lines if he forced it hard enough. But it didn't. Truth has a way of staying exactly where it is, no matter how uncomfortable it becomes. My daughter-in-law was the first to move again, her fingers sliding the paper slightly toward her, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she was no longer reading, she was calculating. Adjusting. Looking for the next move. This doesn't give you full control, she said finally, her voice steady, but sharper now. It just complicates things. Complicates. I let the words settle before responding. Only if you were expecting something simple. She held my gaze for a second longer than before, and in that moment, I could see it clearly. Not anger. Not even frustration. But recognition. The kind that comes when you realize the person you underestimated isn't who you thought they were. My son exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead like he was trying to push the situation back into something manageable. Okay, he said, nodding once, more to himself than to either of us. Okay, then we'll just figure this out another way. Another way. That was the first honest thing he had said all night. Because this had never been about fairness. Or concern. Or even practicality. It had always been about outcome. About control. And now that one path had closed, they were already looking for another. I stepped a little closer to the table, not aggressively, just enough to make sure my presence couldn't be ignored. You can try, I said quietly. That stopped him. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how they landed. Calm. Certain. Without challenge, but without permission either. My daughter-in-law leaned back in her chair now, crossing her arms slowly. A different posture. Defensive, but composed. We're not your enemies, she said, though the statement felt more like a position she was trying to establish than something she believed. We're your family. Family. I nodded once. You are. And I left it there. Because sometimes, agreeing without adding anything else is more unsettling than disagreement. The silence that followed stretched longer this time. Not empty, but full of things neither of them knew how to say. My son looked at me again, but differently now. Not as someone he needed to manage or convince, or move aside, but as someone he didn't fully understand anymore. When did you, he started, then trailed off, unable to finish the question. When did I realize? I offered gently. He nodded. I considered that for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to give him the right one. Not the easiest. Not the kind that would soften what had already happened. Just the truth. A while ago, I said. Before tonight. Before the papers. Before the conversations you thought I wasn't hearing. His expression shifted again. That flicker of guilt, small, quick, but unmistakable. And you didn't say anything? He asked. No, I replied. Why not? That question came faster this time. Less controlled. More human. I met his eyes steadily. Because I wanted to see how far you were willing to go. It landed heavier than anything else I had said. My daughter-in-law's gaze snapped toward him briefly, then back to me. There it was again, that calculation, now mixed with something else. Concern. Not for me. Not even for the situation. But for how much had already been revealed. This is unnecessary, she said quickly. We can still come to an agreement here. Something that works for everyone. I almost smiled. Not out of amusement, but recognition. This was the shift. The moment where control tries to reshape itself into compromise. Where certainty softens into negotiation. But I didn't move. I'm not looking for an agreement, I said. Another pause. My son straightened slightly, his jaw tightening. Then what are you looking for? I didn't answer right away. I let the question sit there, not because I didn't have an answer, but because some answers need to be felt before they're understood. Finally, I spoke. Clarity. The words seemed to catch them off guard. Clarity about what? He asked. About where I stand, I said. And where I don't. I glanced briefly around the room, the walls, the furniture, the space that had once held something entirely different. Then I looked back at them. You thought this was your house, I continued quietly. That I was just living in it. Neither of them spoke. You thought time, paperwork, and a few quiet conversations were enough to change that. Still nothing. I let out a slow breath, not tired, not emotional, just steady. But what you didn't understand, I said, is that I was never standing in your way. I paused just long enough for it to settle. You were just standing in your own. For a moment, no one moved. The room held that fragile kind of stillness that comes right after something shifts, when the old version of reality has cracked, but the new one hasn't fully settled yet. My son looked like he wanted to say something, anything, to pull the situation back into something familiar. Something he could control. But there was nothing left to grab onto. Not anymore. I didn't wait for him to find the words. Instead, I reached down and picked up my suitcase again, my movements calm, unhurried, exactly the way they had been all evening. But this time, it wasn't about playing into their expectations. It was about closing a chapter on my own terms. I turned slightly, as if I were about to head toward the door, and I could feel it immediately, the shift in their posture, the subtle easing, the almost invisible release of tension. They thought this was it. That I had finally accepted it. That everything would end the way they had planned. And for just a second, I let them believe it. Because sometimes, the final piece of truth only lands when people think they're already safe. I took 2 slow steps toward the hallway, then stopped. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just enough to break the rhythm. Then I turned back, setting the suitcase down once more in the exact same spot as before. My son frowned. What are you doing? His voice wasn't sharp this time. It was uncertain. And that uncertainty told me everything had already changed. I'm not leaving, I said. The words were quiet. Simple. But they carried more weight than anything else I had said that night. My daughter-in-law straightened immediately, her composure snapping back into place like it had been waiting for this moment. You can't just decide that, she said, her tone controlled but tighter now. That's not how this works. I met her gaze calmly. It's exactly how it works. My son stepped forward then, his earlier confidence trying to reassemble itself, but it didn't quite fit the same way anymore. Mom, we've already gone over this. No, I said gently, cutting him off. You went over it. You decided. You planned. I let that settle before continuing. But you never asked. Silence again. But this time, it didn't belong to them. It belonged to me. You assumed I would step aside, I said. That I would pack my things, thank you for your concern, and disappear quietly. I glanced briefly at the document still lying on the table. You assumed wrong. My daughter-in-law exhaled slowly, her patience thinning now, the edges of her control starting to show. This isn't productive, she said. We're trying to move forward, and you're making it more complicated than it needs to be. Complicated. That word again. I shook my head slightly. No, I replied. I'm making it accurate. That landed harder than anything else. Because accuracy doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It simply exists. My son looked between us, his frustration building now, not because he was losing, but because he didn't understand how. So what are you saying? He asked. That nothing changes? That we just pretend this never happened? I held his gaze steadily. No, I said. Everything changes. Another pause. But not the way you expected. I stepped closer to the table, placing my hand lightly on the back of the chair, the same chair my husband used to sit in every evening, the one that had remained empty since he passed. For a brief moment, I let myself feel that absence. Not as weakness. But as reminder. You thought this was about time, I continued quietly. About giving me 60 minutes, setting a deadline, controlling the outcome. I looked back at him. But this was never about time. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Because what you were trying to take, I added, my voice steady, was never something you could measure in minutes. The room felt different now. Not tense. Not hostile. Just exposed. Like everything that had been carefully arranged was now sitting in plain view, with nothing left to hide behind. My daughter-in-law leaned forward slightly, her voice lower now, more deliberate. Then what happens next? She asked. A fair question. For the first time all evening, I allowed myself a small pause before answering, not for effect, but because the answer mattered. Not just for them. For me. What happens next, I said slowly, is that we stop. Pretending this was ever your decision to make. My son's jaw tightened again, but this time, he didn't interrupt. And we start being honest, I continued. About what this really was. About what you were trying to do. I let the silence hold for just a second longer, then added, because if we're going to move forward, I looked at both of them, one after the other. It's not going to be on the version of the story you wrote without me. My words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled into the room with a kind of quiet finality that neither of them could easily push back against. For a long second, no one spoke. My son stood there, shoulders tense, his mind clearly racing ahead, trying to find a way to regain ground that had already slipped from under him. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, had gone still, completely still, the way people do when they realize the situation has shifted beyond their control and every next move has to be measured. And that's when I saw it. Not panic. Not yet. But calculation turning into caution. She leaned forward slowly, her fingers resting flat against the table now, no longer tapping, no longer signaling confidence. We're not trying to rewrite anything, she said carefully. We're just trying to find a solution that makes sense for everyone involved. I looked at her for a moment, really looked this time, not as my son's wife, not as part of the family I once tried to hold together, but as someone who had spent years positioning herself quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to step forward. A solution, I repeated softly. Then I shook my head. No. What you were trying to do wasn't a solution. My son let out a sharp breath, his frustration finally breaking through. Then what was it? He demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like we were just trying to help you. Help. That word always sounds so clean. So harmless. I turned to him, my expression calm, my voice even. Help doesn't come with deadlines, I said. And it doesn't come with ultimatums. That stopped him. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. I stepped slightly closer, not invading his space, just enough to make sure he couldn't look past me or around me. Help doesn't happen in conversations I'm not part of, I continued. And it doesn't involve making decisions about my life without ever asking me what I want. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Because there wasn't a clean way out of that. My daughter-in-law shifted again, her composure tightening, her tone sharpening just enough to show the edge beneath it. You're taking this personally, she said. This isn't about emotions, it's about practicality. I almost smiled. Everything is personal, I replied quietly. When it's your life. That landed harder than anything else so far. The room felt smaller now. Not physically, but in the way tension compresses space, makes every movement, every breath feel more deliberate. My son ran his hand along the back of his neck, pacing once, then stopping again as if he couldn't decide where to stand anymore. So what? He said finally. What are you going to do? Just stay here and pretend nothing's changed? I let that question sit for a moment. Not because I needed time to answer, but because I wanted him to hear it fully. To understand what he was really asking. Then I shook my head slowly. No, I said. I'm not pretending anything. I reached over and slid the document a little closer to them, not pushing it, not forcing it, just making sure it remained exactly where it needed to be. Visible. Unavoidable. What I'm doing, I continued, is making sure that what's real, stays real. My daughter-in-law's eyes flickered down to the paper again, then back up to me. That calculation was still there, but now it had something else mixed in. Resistance. The kind that comes when someone realizes they're no longer dictating the pace. This doesn't end here, she said quietly. I nodded. No. It doesn't. Another silence. But this one felt different. Because now, it wasn't about what had already happened. It was about what came next. And for the first time that evening, I saw something shift in my son's expression that hadn't been there before. Not anger. Not frustration. Something quieter. Something heavier. Doubt, turning into realization. You knew, he said slowly. Not a question. A statement. I held his gaze. Yes. For how long? I didn't hesitate this time. Long enough. He looked down again, not at the document, but at the floor, as if trying to trace back every moment that had led here. Every conversation. Every decision. Every assumption. And that's when it finally happened. The shift. Not loud. Not dramatic. But undeniable. Because the moment he realized I hadn't been reacting tonight. I had been waiting. Everything else, his tone, his posture, even the way he stood in that room, began to change around that understanding. The certainty was gone now. Replaced by something far less comfortable. Uncertainty. And just beneath it, the quiet, growing awareness that the outcome he had been so sure of was no longer his to control. My son didn't argue this time. That was the first sign everything had truly shifted. Instead, he stood there, staring at nothing in particular, his mind clearly trying to catch up to a reality that had already moved past him. The room felt different now, not tense in the same way as before, not sharp or confrontational, but heavier. Like something had settled into place that couldn't be undone with words. My daughter-in-law was the first to break the silence again, but even she sounded different. More careful. More aware of where she was standing. "We need to be realistic," she said, her tone measured, controlled. "This situation, it's not sustainable. For any of us." I looked at her, not dismissing the statement, not agreeing with it either. Just acknowledging it. "You're right," I said. That caught her off guard. Because agreement, in moments like this, doesn't always mean alignment. "It's not sustainable," I continued calmly. "Not the way you planned it." My son shifted slightly at that, his jaw tightening again, but he didn't interrupt. Not this time. He was listening now. Really listening. I walked slowly around the table, my hand brushing lightly against the back of each chair as I passed, the familiar wood grounding me in a way nothing else could. This wasn't just a room. It was history. And history doesn't disappear just because someone decides to rewrite it. You both built something. Tonight, I said quietly. A version of reality where I was no longer part of the equation. I paused behind my chair, the one I had sat in for decades, and rested my hand there for a moment. But you forgot one thing. Neither of them spoke. You don't get to remove someone from a life they built. The words didn't need emphasis. They carried their own weight. My daughter-in-law straightened slightly, her posture shifting again, less defensive now, more strategic. "No one is removing you," she said quickly. "We're just trying to restructure things in a way that makes sense going forward." Restructure. Another clean word. Another careful layer. I nodded slowly. "And in that structure," I asked, "where exactly was I supposed to stand?" She hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. My son looked at her, then back at me, and for the first time, there was no answer ready. No script. No prepared reasoning. Just a gap. And in that gap, the truth. I didn't press further. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked back to where I had placed my suitcase and rested my hand on the handle, not to pick it up, but to anchor the moment. "You gave me 60 minutes, I said again, my voice steady. "And you expected that time to work in your favor." I looked directly at him. "But time doesn't belong to the person who sets the deadline." He swallowed slightly, his expression tightening, not in anger, but in something closer to realization. "It belongs to the person who understands it." Silence followed. Deep. Unavoidable. My daughter-in-law exhaled slowly, her composure slipping just enough to reveal something underneath, not panic, but pressure. The kind that builds when control starts to fracture and there's no clear way to put it back together. "So what now?" she asked, her voice lower this time. Less polished. More direct. That question hung in the air, heavier than anything else that had been said. Because now, it wasn't about what had happened. It was about consequence. I didn't answer right away. I let the moment stretch, not to create tension, but to let them sit in it. To feel the weight of everything that had led us here. Then I spoke. "Now," I said slowly, "we stop pretending this was ever a misunderstanding." My son looked up at me sharply, but didn't interrupt. "This wasn't about helping me," I continued. "It wasn't about making things easier. It was about control. About deciding what happens next without including the person it actually affects." His eyes dropped slightly at that. Not in defeat, but in recognition. "And now," I added, "that decision doesn't belong to you anymore." That was it. That was the moment. The one where everything tipped. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But completely. Because control, once questioned, doesn't come back the same way. My daughter-in-law leaned back slowly, her arms uncrossing, her posture shifting again, not defensive, not aggressive, but something else entirely. Reassessing. Recalculating. Because for the first time that night, she wasn't looking at me as someone to manage. She was looking at me as someone she had misjudged. And my son. He wasn't looking at me as someone he could move anymore. He was looking at me as someone he had already tried, and failed, to move. I let the silence settle one last time, my hands still resting lightly on the suitcase, my posture steady, unchanged. Then I said the one thing neither of them had expected to hear when this night began. You don't need to give me more time. I met his eyes. I'm not going anywhere. My words didn't leave room for interpretation this time. They didn't need to. The moment they landed, something inside the room shifted again, but differently than before. Not like a crack forming. Not like control slipping. This time, it felt like something had already broken, and everyone finally realized it at the same time. My son didn't move right away. He just stood there, staring at me, as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the one he thought he understood. The one who would quietly adjust. The one who would step aside. The one who would accept. That version of me no longer existed, not for him, not in this room, not in this moment. You're serious, he said finally, his voice lower now. Not challenging. Not dismissive. Just, uncertain. I nodded once. I am. That was all it took. He looked away then, running his hand across his face, slower this time. Not out of frustration, but out of something heavier. Something closer to realization than anger. This isn't how I thought this would go, he muttered, almost to himself. No, I replied quietly. It isn't. My daughter-in-law didn't speak immediately. She had gone still again, but not in the same way as before. Earlier, her silence had been strategic, controlled, intentional. Now, it felt different. More like she was reassessing everything in real time, trying to understand where exactly things had slipped beyond her influence. We can still fix this, she said finally, but the confidence was thinner now. Not gone, but strained. There's no reason for this to turn into something bigger than it needs to be. I looked at her, steady, calm. It already is. That stopped her. Because deep down, she knew it was true. This had never been about space. Or logistics. Or practicality. It had crossed into something else the moment they decided to move me out of my own life without ever asking if I wanted to stay. And once something crosses that line, it doesn't just go back. My son exhaled slowly, shaking his head once, like he was trying to clear something that wouldn't clear. So what now? He asked again, but this time, the question carried something it hadn't before. Not demand. Not control. Just, uncertainty. I let that sit for a moment. Then I answered. Now, I said, you decide what kind of person you want to be after this. That landed deeper than anything else I had said all night. Because for the first time, this wasn't about me. It was about him. He looked up at me sharply, caught off guard, his expression tightening, not in defense, but in something closer to discomfort. What does that mean? He asked. It means, I said, my voice still calm, still even, you already made a choice tonight. I gestured lightly toward the table, the document, the space between us. You decided I was something you could move. Something you could manage. Something you could remove. He flinched slightly at that. Just enough to show he felt it. And now, I continued, you have to decide what you do with that. Silence again. But not empty. Not tense. Reflective. My daughter-in-law shifted in her seat, her composure tightening again, trying to regain some form of control over the direction of the conversation. This isn't fair, she said. You're putting everything on him like this was all his decision. I turned to her slowly. I'm not putting anything on him, I replied. I'm just not taking it away. That was the difference. For years, longer than I had realized, I had been smoothing things over. Filling in gaps. Making sure everyone else stayed comfortable, even when something didn't feel right. Even when something was shifting beneath the surface. Not anymore. My son sat down then, heavily, like something had finally caught up with him. His shoulders dropped slightly, his posture no longer holding that earlier certainty. He looked older in that moment. Not physically, but in the way people do when they're forced to confront something they've been avoiding. I didn't think, he started, then stopped. I didn't interrupt. Because some realizations need space. I didn't think it would feel like this, he finished quietly. I nodded once. It usually doesn't. Another pause. Then he looked up at me again, and for the first time all night, there was no calculation in his eyes. No strategy. No attempt to control the outcome. Just awareness. And maybe, just beneath it, something like regret. My daughter-in-law noticed it too. I could see it in the way her posture shifted again, the way her attention moved between him and me, trying to understand what had just changed. Because this quiet shift in him, was something she hadn't planned for. None of this was. I let the moment sit, not pushing it further, not trying to force anything out of it. Because this wasn't about winning. It never was. It was about truth. And truth, once it settles in, doesn't need to be argued. I reached down and picked up my suitcase again, this time not as part of their expectation, not as part of any plan, but simply because it was there. I didn't move toward the door. I didn't move at all. I just held it lightly at my side, steady, grounded. Then I looked at both of them, really looked. And in that quiet, steady moment, one thing became clear. Whatever they thought this night was going to end with. It wasn't this. I didn't say anything else right away. I didn't need to. Some moments don't require more words, they require space. Space for truth to settle. Space for people to sit with what they've done, without being rescued from it. The room stayed quiet, but it wasn't the same silence from earlier. That silence had been filled with control, with expectation, with something waiting to happen. This one was different. It was heavier. Real. My son remained seated, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze lowered, not out of submission, but reflection. For the first time that night, he wasn't trying to fix anything. He wasn't trying to steer the conversation or find a way out. He was just there. And sometimes, that's where change begins, not in words, but in stillness. My daughter-in-law, however, stayed upright, composed, her posture still holding on to something, pride, maybe. Or distance. She didn't interrupt again. She didn't try to redirect. She simply watched, her eyes moving between us, as if trying to understand how something so carefully planned had unraveled without noise, without confrontation, without the kind of chaos she had been prepared to manage. And that was the thing. There had been no explosion. No shouting. No scene. Just truth, placed quietly on the table, and left there. I shifted the suitcase slightly in my hand, then set it down beside the chair one last time, not as a symbol of leaving, not as a prop in their version of events, but as something that no longer carried any weight. Because the truth was, I had never been packing to go. Not really. I had been preparing for something else entirely. I walked slowly back to my place at the table and rested my hand on the back of the chair, the same one I had sat in for decades. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes, not out of weakness, not out of grief, but out of recognition. Of everything this space had held. Of everything it still held. Then I opened them again. This house, I said quietly, not looking at either of them yet, was never just walls and furniture. They didn't respond. It was built with choices, I continued. With years. With things that don't show up on paper. Now I looked at my son. Your father understood that. His eyes lifted slowly to meet mine. There was something there now that hadn't been there before. Not just doubt. Not just regret. Something deeper. Something closer to understanding. That's why he made sure this place couldn't be reduced to a decision made at a dinner table, I added. The words didn't accuse. They didn't need to. They clarified. My daughter-in-law shifted slightly, her composure holding, but quieter now. Less certain. Less defined. Because clarity does that, it removes the space where control used to live. I pulled out the chair and sat down, not as someone reclaiming territory, not as someone making a point, but as someone who had never truly left. My hands rested calmly on the table, the same table where this entire moment had begun. No one is being forced out tonight, I said. Not me. Not you. That caught them off guard. Because they had expected a final move. A decision. A consequence delivered in a way they could react to. But this wasn't about reaction. It was about reset. But things don't go back to the way they were, I continued. Because now we all know exactly where we stand. My son swallowed slightly, nodding once, not in agreement, but in acceptance. A quiet kind of acceptance that doesn't fix anything immediately, but opens the door to something more honest. I didn't see it, he said finally, his voice low. Not the way it was becoming. I held his gaze. I know. And I meant it. Because sometimes people don't set out to betray you. Sometimes they just stop seeing you clearly. And if no one interrupts that, it becomes something else entirely. My daughter-in-law didn't speak. Not this time. And that silence told its own story. I reached over and gently straightened the document on the table, not to emphasize it, not to remind them of anything, but simply to put it back in its place. Then I leaned back slightly in my chair, the tension in the room no longer pressing in the same way. You gave me 60 minutes, I said, my voice steady, almost reflective now. And you thought that was enough to change everything. I paused. But all it did was show me what needed to stay the same. Neither of them moved. Neither of them argued. Because there was nothing left to argue with. The truth had already settled. And for the first time that night, the house felt like mine again. Not because of a document. Not because of a clause or a signature. But because I was no longer standing in it as someone waiting to be told where I belonged. I already knew. I glanced once toward the window. The sun had fully set now, the sky outside dark and still, the kind of quiet that comes at the end of a long day, not empty, not uncertain, just complete. Then I looked back at them, my expression calm, unchanged. They thought they had an hour, I said softly. A small pause. But I had a lifetime.